Sometimes it takes a minute because I have a setting on mine where it lets me undo sending an email, and so it takes about 30 seconds for it to actually send. The subject of the email is Hangout 2. Cool. There we go. Cool. All right, I'm going to hang up. Are you guys able? Can you hear me? Oh, I think I can hear Aiden. I just can't hear you guys. Try clicking the little toolbar, or the little gear for settings in the toolbar, and make sure that your microphone is set to default microphone.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. We're trying to, but we're having trouble. I don't know, maybe you can. Can you hear the people who are at Mrs. Henderson's house? I can't. Hey. I'm not sure. I'm not really sure what the issue is. I was checking to see if maybe I had muted you on my end, but that doesn't seem to be the case, and Aiden can't hear you either. Sorry? Sure. If you can just close out and then use the same link to come back in, we can give that a shot. There is not another link that I can use to bring you into the actual conversation. Unfortunately, that's the only one. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, we can definitely do that. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think Aiden must have gotten the second link. So I sent 2 links. The first one wasn't working for some reason, so you'll have to send Oliver the second link. You can invite them. I would just send them the link. Is probably the easiest way. Yeah, through Google Hangouts. Yeah, I guess so. It might be easier. The reason why we can't do it over phone is because it's going to create a lot of feedback in the actual video. The sound will create feedback in the video. Okay, we can do that. Okay. Either is fine. Whatever's the easiest way for him is fine. You can tell him. Yeah. I honestly, I think it'll probably be easier to just type the question in, and it'll give me a notification when you guys send in a question, and I can just answer it that way. I think that'll be best. Oliver seems to be muted, and a cat.
Yeah, I'm here.
Great. Okay, I'm going to hang up the phone. Oh, okay. Yeah, he can hear. He said that he can. Cool. All right. Cool. Yep.
So what's the plan now?
Okay, so I've prepared a lecture. It'll be about 20 to 30 minutes, probably. And we'll pause in between if you guys have questions. Aiden and Oliver, if you have questions, you can just ask. Feel free to interrupt when there seems to be an appropriate place to do so, and I'll stop and ask for questions. And then for people at Mrs. Henderson's house, just send a message into the group chat. I will be monitoring it. And as I see questions, I will answer them. So yeah, so there are or I guess three things that I'm going to talk about in the lecture. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just sort of the particular distinctions about BP, and in a little bit of a way, sort of how to use the skills and strategy that you guys have honed in Danaeus, or sort of the traditional sort of debate skills that you have, and sort of adapt them to BP in particular. Secondly, we're going to talk about impacting, what impacting is, how it's particularly useful and important for BP, and sort of the appropriate ways and sort of less appropriate ways to do impacting, and as well as weighing, which is an important component of impacting. And then lastly, Mrs. Henderson asked me to talk to you guys about bottom half or back half in particular, and sort of the strategy within back half, sort of little tricks to use to make your back half presentation a little bit stronger, and so forth. And I will pause intermittently for questions, or if you guys have questions, feel free to interrupt, like I said earlier. So, with that, actually, I guess the way that I can know if you're about to ask me a question is if I see somebody in front of the computer. Is there a question? Cool. What's different about BP? So the biggest difference in BP. Okay. So I will go through the responsibilities for each speaker. So this will kind of fit in here. So what's particularly different about BP from sort of Danaeus and the other types of debate that you're particularly familiar with? So the biggest one is obviously that there are 4 teams in a room, 8 people in a room. And so there are a couple of things that become different about BP as a product of that particular structure. So the first thing is that, and probably the biggest thing, is that in Danaeus, or in any sort of 2v2 or even 3v3 type of debate, you're arguing only against the people who are opposing your position in the debate. Which is to say, if the motion says this house supports X and you're on government, the only people who you are actually competing against to win the round are the people who are arguing against that particular proposition. The difference in BP is obviously that when there is a front half, an opening government and a closing government, an opening opposition and a closing opposition, you're also competing against people who you aren't arguing against, which sort of goes against the sort of idea of what we traditionally think of as debate, or we traditionally think of as an argument. So as a result, the competition is in BP is sort of different, right? So like whereas in Danaeus you try to make arguments that beat your opponent's arguments, in BP you have to make arguments that beat your opponent's arguments, but you also have to have your arguments be more persuasive than those that are made by the other people on your bench. So if you're the opening up government, you have to make arguments against the opposition that are more convincing than the arguments that are going to be made by closing government. So that means that there are a few things specific to each speaker role on top half. So at this part in the conversation, I'm going to talk about the top half speaker roles in particular. I'll talk about the bottom half speaker roles when I get to the sort of deeper discussion of bottom half. But what does it mean that you have to make more persuasive arguments on top half than are going to come about on bottom half when you don't know what the bottom half arguments are going to be? There are 2 things. The first thing is that as the Prime Minister, your goal is to try to lay out as many of the arguments as possible and develop them as much as possible that you can think of for your side of the debate. So as the Prime Minister, you're trying to think of every argument possible, or as opening government in general, you're trying to think of every argument possible to affirm the motion, and then in the Prime Minister's speech, you're going to try to lay out as many of those as possible. A lot of people end up thinking that this means like you're supposed to be making 7 different arguments, that you should have, that you should have 7 arguments within your prime minister's speech, which is certainly not the case. You should still try to boil this down to 2 or at most 3 arguments that you're going to give in the prime minister's speech. But all of the sort of little sub-arguments or smaller arguments that you might come up with can probably be sorted into sort of 2 or 3 different areas of analysis within that speech. So, and as the prime minister, as the first speaker on the top half, your job is just to construct arguments. It's to lay out the debate. People often misinterpret this as meaning that their job is really easy as the prime minister. That's not quite the case, because perhaps the most important responsibility of the prime minister, independent of making arguments, is establishing sort of the model for the debate. And Mrs. Henderson can talk to you guys about what the model means. But all that's particularly important in terms of the model is sort of like your plan, or even it can be as simple as just definitions of the terms in the debate that you think are particularly important. The reason why this is important to the rest of the round, and why people often undervalue that, and why it's a problem that people often undervalue it, is because if you give a bad model, you set up a bad debate. And the biggest responsibility of the prime minister's speech is to set up as good of a debate as possible, and we'll become clear why that's important in a second. So then the second speech on top half is the leader of the opposition's speech. And the leader of the opposition, similar to the prime minister's job, is to construct the arguments for the opposition bench. Try to present as many of the arguments as possible for their side, so that if the bottom half team were to try to make the same arguments, they would be considered derivative, or they wouldn't be credited entirely to the bottom half team. We'll talk about what that means a little bit later. But similarly, you're just trying to make as many of the arguments as possible, so that there are fewer new arguments available for the bottom half team to make. Additionally, you have to respond to the prime minister's speech. Ideally, in BP debate, this is not done sort of going down a flow as you would traditionally do in Danaeus, but instead you sort of do what's called thematic refutation, meaning that you identify sort of the biggest arguments, or the most important, the strongest arguments in the prime minister's speech, and this is true of refutation throughout the round. This is true of all refutation in BP debate. You figure out what the most important things in your opponent's speech were, and respond to those specifically, and give a couple of really good wards. But there's no line-by-line refutation in BP debate. As independent of that, no, there's no such thing as a dropped point. In fact, if you say that somebody dropped something in BP debate, you'll get laughed at. There's no dropping arguments. In fact, if an argument, so it's complicated. There's a little bit of nuance to this. But in terms of sort of the way that we think of a dropped argument in Danaeus, that doesn't exist. What can happen is that a team doesn't respond to a particularly good argument. Like if the prime minister makes a very good argument, the leader of the opposition does not respond to it, then certainly you should point out that that argument wasn't responded to, but you have to do additional argumentative work to show why it was that that argument was important, and why it's a problem for them that they didn't respond to it. It's not the case like in Danaeus, where you can say, because they dropped this argument, it's true for the purposes of the round and we win the debate. There's no, the best way to think about it is that there's just no way to automatically win a BP round, whereas there are certain ways, because of the rules of Danaeus debate, that you can automatically win. So in that sense, there's no such thing as a dropped point. It is in your interest, if you make a really good argument that doesn't get responded to make sure that you point out that that argument wasn't responded to, because the way that BP tends to interpret arguments that sort of fall out of relevance within the debate is that if an argument did not stay relevant, i.e. if your opponents didn't feel the need to respond to it because they didn't feel that it was a very strong argument, then the judges will evaluate it as just that. They might independently evaluate whether it was a strong argument that they should have responded to, but sort of the default position is that if an argument wasn't really relevant and compelling, then that's probably the reason why it wasn't being responded to. So I hope that clarifies the stance on dropped points. I'm happy to answer more questions about that later. So yeah, and then the deputy prime minister and the deputy leader of the opposition have fairly similar roles. The deputy prime minister should be sort of adding some new analysis, should be responding to the leader of the opposition's arguments and rebuilding the prime minister's arguments, and additionally adding some new analysis to the prime minister's arguments, some new component to the debate. You can sort of think of it as sort of a hybrid between an extension speech, which we'll talk about later, where you give a new argument for the round, and it's certainly okay in a deputy speech to just give a brand new argument. Say, this is like in my speech, I will rebuild my partner's points, refute the leader of the opposition's arguments, and give you X new argument. Or you don't have to have a particular and independent new argument, but instead can sort of summarize the top half of the round, that has happened thus far, similar to the way that a whip speaker sort of gives a rebuttal about the debate, and within that add some newer depth of analysis to the arguments that have already happened on both sides rather. And the deputy leader of the opposition's role is more or less identical to that of the prime minister, the deputy prime minister, but just doing it for the opposition side. So what does all of this mean for the way that BP is adjudicated? So BP is adjudicated very differently from the way that Danaeus is. So basically, the winner of a BP round that is judged, adequately, is not necessarily the team that most convincingly beat the arguments made by the other side. Which isn't to say that it's not important to beat their other arguments. You will not win the round if you don't beat the other arguments. But it's most often the team that made the most important contributions to the round, meaning that not only did you make the most important, if you're on government, you made the government argument that best beat the opposition's points not only came from you and your partner, but remained either, if you were on top half, remained relevant throughout the rest of the debate, or if you were on bottom half, made it such that the top half arguments became significantly less relevant when you made that argument. Which is why, so if you were to put this kind of differently, it's basically the team that did the most to clarify and enhance the quality of the debate will most frequently win the round, or get the one in the round, or get a higher rank within the round. So that's why on top half you're basically trying to make all of the strongest arguments for your position is to increase the probability that the most relevant contribution to the round will come from you. And that's why on bottom half you're trying to illustrate why the argument that you've made is the most important and relevant argument in the debate that wasn't made on top half. So if that makes sense. Do you guys have any questions about that? P.S. Oliver, it says you're muted, so if you are talking and asking a question, I cannot hear you.
No, I don't have a question.
Cool. So my last comment on what makes BP different from Danaeus, and this is sort of more a strategic component and isn't necessarily, it is a thing to keep in the back of your mind during prep. So BP motions, like a lot of motions in Danaeus extemporaneous debate or in the types of debates that are prepared, so if you go to Loomis or St. Paul's or other tournaments that have a prepared motion, those motions are usually selected because they're relevant to something that's really important and current in the world, but they may not be immediately obvious based on the language of the motion. So what do I mean by this? For example, a couple of weekends ago I was at a tournament where the motion for round one was this house believes that Japan should remilitarize. So the most obvious implication is that that debate probably has something to do with Japanese security, Japanese economic interests, and sort of regional security issues. But it has much broader implications, and the reason why that motion was set in particular is because it also has an important component of it, which discusses the relationship between China and the West and China and the United States. The United States is probably Japan's most important global ally, and more broadly, sort of Cold War politics and Cold War mentality, and how those ideas that we understand in history remain relevant today. So why is it important to just sort of have these ideas of what the sort of bigger and in some ways maybe sort of more guiding philosophical questions that underlie these motions are? It's because the ability to be the first team in the room to identify sort of the big principle on which this debate is, which makes the debate relevant and sort of is the reason why the motion is being set. Being the first team in the round to identify that is an incredible strategic advantage because it shows not only that you know a lot about the world, basically, and it's not just knowing a lot about the world in terms of international relations, but if it's debate about feminism um, or or just like philosophical questions, understanding why these things are, these sort of broad motions that we're talking about in sort of loftier debate ideas are really relevant to the world, not only shows your judge that it's sort of important that we're having this conversation in the first place, but also shows that you're sort of the authoritative and credible figure in the round to be talking about why this debate is happening. And it makes your arguments sound that much more credible when you sort of understand why the debate is relevant in the first place. So just kind of keep that in mind. Most motions are set for a particular reason. And try to, in prep, ask yourself, why are we having this debate? And oftentimes, the answer to that question will make for an excellent and extremely compelling overview in your speech. Also, just a side note on overviews. Overviews are often a lot longer in Danaeus, but in BP, your overview should be no longer than 10 or 15 seconds. It should be sort of one line that establishes, like one or maybe two sentences that establishes how what your position in the round is. Or like not to say like, are you opening government, although it can reference what position you are, but what your stance in the round is, what you're arguing for, and sort of what the principle that you think makes this debate important and why you think your side is the correct side. Relevant to the debate that's happening around you. So yeah, so that's sort of the comments on what makes BP different from Danaeus. Does anyone have any questions before we go on?
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
Should you define your terms first, or should you do the overview first?
If you're giving an overview, you should always give your overview first. That's a good question. So whereas, for instance, many of you who went to Yale, for example, Yale probably had you define the terms before the round began. That doesn't happen in BP. So what you should give, and this only is relevant in the Prime Minister's speech, but what you should give is you should give your overview, and then immediately say, our model for this debate will be to define, if you're just giving definitions, you say, our model for this debate will be to define, X, Y, and Z. If it's a motion, for instance, like this House believes that Japan should remilitarize, your model should be a little bit different, but still it should be short and sort of to the point. But your model could be something to the effect of, and if possible, your model should demonstrate some knowledge of the reason why the debate is happening. So Japan doesn't have an offensive military based on clauses in their constitution established after World War II. So your model could be, we're specifically saying that Japan should abolish that Japan should abolish the clause in their constitution that prohibits them from establishing an offensive military, and on top of that, Japan should affirmatively push for offensive military capabilities. That could be your model. But notice, like, aside from the fact that I was kind of thinking of that on the fly, like, you could say that in about 15 seconds. And so between that and your overview, that should not be taking more than 30 to 45 seconds of your speech. But your overview, if you're giving one, should always come first. Any other questions? All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about for a couple of minutes is impacting. So in debate in general, you basically have to do two things to make your argument important, or to make your argument sort of strategically advantageous. For it to achieve the end of helping you win the debate, you need to do two things. First, you need to show why your argument is true, i.e. give evidence or logical analysis that illustrates why it is that the proposition that you're putting forth is true in the real world. Secondly, though, and this is where impact, and so the truth component of it is sort of the warrants or analysis, might be the terms that you use to describe it. Do you think it's okay? Hang on, there was just a question. So you guys just asked, do you think it's okay if we define the debate to be in the United States? For McGill, no. You should not do that. In fact, in general, you should not specifically define it. If at any time you are particularly limiting the scope of debate, you should try to minimize the degree to which you have to limit the debate. So if you feel like you would have to like you want to talk about the United States, and for instance, you don't want to talk about the developing world, for instance. Instead of defining the debate as existing in the United States, say that you're going to define the debate as existing in liberal democracies. The reason why this is important is because, one, sort of international BP debate tends to think that American debaters are sort of unaware that there is a world around them. And defining the debate to take place only in the US sort of makes it sound like you only know how to talk about the United States. So you should try as often as possible to use international examples and not just you. There's nothing wrong with using examples from the United States, but you should not try to make the debate exclusively about the United States, and you should try to whatever degree possible to use international examples. Secondly, even if you're only going to talk about the United States, defining it as liberal democracies, which is to say democracies that sort of have like conceptions of civil liberties, to have free speech, free press, like kind of the principles on which the U.S. lies, except generally not the right to bear arms. There is, even if you're only going to talk about the U.S., defining it that way, one, doesn't make it sound like you're trying to limit the debate, because you can still talk about, for instance, Australia, or for you guys this weekend, Canada is also a liberal democracy. So is the United Kingdom, so is France, so is South Africa in many ways. So there's still a lot of ground to talk about in the debate. Japan is also a liberal democracy. And it gives you the ground to talk about the United States while still allowing other people to use the examples that they may find most relevant. So it would not. So in summary, it would not be viewed as a contribution to the debate. And keeping in mind that making contributions to the quality of debate is what lets you win the round. It would not be viewed as a contribution to the quality of the debate to define the debate as only being in the U.S. So yeah. So anyway, back to impacting. So in debate, so you have two jobs. You have to first show why the argument is true, and that's like sort of giving warrants. The second thing, and what is relevant to impacting, is showing why your argument is important. So unless your argument is important, and this is especially important in BP, there's no reason why judges should decide that your arguments win the round. In order for your arguments to win the round, they have to be the most important arguments to the debate. And they have to, on the comparative, be more important than the arguments made either by the opposition team or by the other team on your bench. So impacting, like we said, it demonstrates the reason why your argument is important, and thus why it should be valued in the context of the round. So keeping that in mind, this is sort of the definition of an impact is like sort of what happens in the world as a result of your warrants being true. So it's basically the implication. It's the almost like tangible item that the judge has to consider when they're adjudicating the round. So an impact could be something like the Iran nuclear deal is important because it prevents Iran from pursuing nuclear weapons. The reason why it's important for Iran not to pursue nuclear weapons is because, one, it increases the likelihood that nuclear weapons fall into the hands of terrorists. That's your first impact. Two, it gives Iran greater regional ability to balance against Israel, which is not in the interest of the United States. That's your second impact. And those are the types of things that your judge is going to be actually evaluating the importance of when they're deciding whether or not your argument that the Iran nuclear deal is important is an argument that is going to win the round. That said, and this was that was actually a little bit of a bad example because of this, make sure you don't overstate your impacts, because doing so will basically cause you to lose credibility with your judge and undermine your arguments a little bit. So there are a lot of forms of debate that actually want you and encourage you to overstate your impacts. And basically they want you to show how your opponent's arguments are going to lead to thermonuclear annihilation. And unless you can show that your opponent's arguments are going to lead to thermonuclear annihilation, and they want you to use the words thermonuclear annihilation, you will probably not win the round. They want you to do something like this. They want you to make the argument that if we don't stop drilling for oil in Alaska, we'll have so little extra oil that we'll stop buying oil from Venezuela, who will in turn try to increase their regional influence by developing nuclear weapons. The more nuclear powers there are in the world, the more likely it is that a nuke ends up in the hands of terrorists, and they'll set one off, leading to total global thermonuclear annihilation. That's a bad argument and a very bad impact. And we'll talk about why in a second. But the fact that we just got from oil drilling in Alaska to thermonuclear annihilation is both indicative of probably bad logical internal logic justifying why that's true. And as a result of that, BP judges, regardless of whether you've done like NFL or other types of sort of more policy-oriented debate that encourage that type of impacting, BP judges will laugh you out of the room for that. And the panel of judges, and there's usually 3 judges in a BP round, will have a lot of fun laughing after the debate at the fact that you just tried to say that oil drilling in Alaska will lead to thermonuclear war. Don't do that. And as a sort of more, but like consider the way that this sort of happens in a more, like it doesn't have to be like thermonuclear annihilation. Just make sure that your impacts seem reasonable, relevant to the argument that you're making. So instead of doing that, just give like several reasonable outcomes for your proposed policy. So instead of saying that oil drilling in Alaska will lead to nuclear war, you instead make the argument that we should stop drilling for oil in Alaska because the ensuing pollution, this is an example, because the ensuing pollution is harmful to salmon runs. Harming salmon runs does 2 really bad things. First, having less biodiversity in salmon populations, meaning that the fish that we eat are less healthy and more likely to contain disease. And second, local communities in Alaska rely on adequate salmon runs to support their economies year-round. Those are 2 impacts that are pretty reasonable. You can clearly see that they're not just things that seem logically correct, but they seem more probably correct. Like if you're evaluating the probability that those arguments are true, you are more likely to evaluate that these are true rather than the fact that oil drilling in Alaska is going to lead to some sort of nuclear annihilation. So just think about how to ensure that your impacts are really reasonable. So the second thing that's important about impacts, though, and the reason why we provide impacts is because impacts are what you as a debater use to show why your arguments are beating your opponents. They're an important way to show why your arguments are beating your opponent's arguments. So there are basically 2 ways to beat your opponent's argument. Either you can beat their logic, so you can show that their argument just isn't true by saying, you know, either their evidence is a lie or the logic that they're using is unsound and give like a counterexample. Or you can concede that their argument is probably true, but that it's outweighed by arguments that you've made. So this is really, really important in BP debate because of how many different like sort of moving parts there are in the round, because there are 8 speakers, because there are 4 teams. You have to show why your arguments outweigh everything else that has happened in the round. And it basically shows why your arguments are more, as a result, your arguments are more valuable. So this is an example of weighing. You can say that our opponent said that drilling for oil in Alaska will ensure that the U.S. has a more stable energy supply for the next 15 years. That's probably true. But what we told you is that this will be crippling to the long-term sustainability of healthy food sources and economic stability in Alaskan communities that don't have many other resources. Our argument outweighs theirs because it is longer lasting. The issue of food sources and economic stability will still be relevant when the oil in Alaska is long gone. And as a result of that, it will affect many more people over time. And for that reason, it outweighs the argument that they made. So you kind of see how that sort of comparative analysis shows that even though the opponent made a probably true argument and even an important argument, and this isn't to say that that argument there couldn't be a weighing mechanism that favors that argument, that you're showing how you believe that your argument outweighs. So there are sort of 2 ways, and you can kind of see how they were implicit in that example, that you can weigh arguments. Arguments can either be weighed based on their magnitude, which basically means that it either affects more people, it lasts a longer period of time, just the consequences are much greater. The harms are bigger. Policy might be more expensive or less expensive, or it could be anything. Something could lead to war. That magnitude is very large. And on top of that, though, you can weigh either in addition to or instead of on magnitude, you can weigh on probability. So the reason why the sort of thermonuclear annihilation impact is a bad impact is because when you evaluate the probability that that happens, then you realize that the risk of that is so infinitesimally small that it sort of pales in comparison to more likely, even if maybe less harmful, alternatives. So, it seems much more likely that the pollution will affect global warming, and it seems more likely that that would be an effect that we have. That it'll, whatever, have some more tangible, that the pollution has a more tangible effect than like this sort of extraneous risk of thermonuclear war. So do you guys understand the difference between impacting and weighing, and then also what the difference between weighing on magnitude and weighing on probability? Do you have any questions? There appears to be a question. Neither neither is better. The best thing to do is do both. So the best thing to do would be to say, the drilling for oil in Alaska will ensure that the U.S. is energy independent for the next 15 years. Say, fine, but we told you that if we become energy independent for the next 15 years, that erodes our sort of resolve to find energy alternatives within those 15 years, meaning that 15 years from now, when that oil runs out, we'll be back to being reliant on other countries and have fewer clean energy sources to use as a result. And we'd be like, and this is a much more likely harm than, I don't know, something else. That wasn't actually a very good example, but see the point. Like, you both say that your policy affects. Oh, no. So this is the magnitude component of it, is then that, like you say, that energy issue affects the entire country, not just Alaska or something like that. So just identify a way that both your policy affects more people and that it's more likely to happen, to happen, if possible. But one is good, two is better. Any other questions?
When you say weighing magnitudes, do you mean that when you say weighing magnitude, do you basically mean showing how your argument how the effects of your argument is better, or how the effect of their argument is worse?
In a way, yes, but there's a little bit more to it than that. So every argument that you make to advance your position should be doing that implicitly. You should be saying, we're doing more good for the world. The magnitude weighing component is showing sort of more how broad how widespread are the effects of that good thing. So an example of the magnitude component is to say, I have $100 to give out. Should I give my $100 to a charity that has really high administrative costs, so say maybe 80% of their donations go towards administrative costs, or to a charity that has 20% of their donations go toward administrative costs? With my same, with that same dollar, that same $100, I affect many more people if I give to the second charity, meaning that the magnitude of my $100 is much larger. Do you see how that means? So both of them are doing good. It's still good to give to charity, but the question is, how many people do I benefit by doing sort of a similar action? Does that make sense? Okay. So it's more how widespread the positive outcomes of your argument are. Any other questions? It's a good question. Cool. If you guys come up with any more questions for things that I've already talked about later, I'll leave you guys my email, but there will be a little bit of time at the end of this, hopefully, to discuss those things. So we can always go back and talk about these things again at the end of the video session. So the last thing we're going to talk about is bottom half. So Mrs. Henderson asked me to talk to you guys about sort of bottom half structure and strategy. So bottom half speakers have a sort of complicated burden that doesn't really exist in other formats of debate. So the first speaker for either side on bottom half is the extension speaker or the member speaker, are the sort of the two terms that you'll hear referring to them as. Their job is to deliver an entirely new argument that was not articulated on top half that advances your position. And so we'll talk about what that means in a second. And then the second speaker for the bottom half is the whip speaker, or sometimes, occasionally, they'll be called the summary speaker. And their job, the reason why they're called the summary speaker, is because your job is to summarize the round while basically showing why the argument that your partner made, so that new argument that didn't exist on top half, why that argument is the most important component of the round, why it's the most important contribution to the round, and why therefore you should get the one. The other thing to just remember about whip speaking is there are no new arguments are not really allowed in the whip speech. Like, you can make them. It's not like Danaeus, where someone can call a point of order and try to say that your argument was new, though the judges will generally be able to identify that your argument was new, and they just won't consider it as helping your side. So basically, new arguments are just wasted time because they're not gonna do anything to help you. The only exception to this is that the government whip can make new arguments responding to the new arguments made by the opposition extension speaker. So the opposition extension speaker, the third person on opposition bench, is going to make one new argument that wasn't made earlier in the round. The government whip can respond to that argument as much as they want during their speech, and those new arguments are fair game. But besides that, new arguments are not allowed. We talked about the second. Yeah, we did. We talked about the second opposition speaker. The responsibilities of the second opposition speaker are more or less the same as the responsibilities of the second government speaker. It's pretty much exactly identical. You should try to make a new argument. You should either try to make a new argument or summarize the top half of the debate while adding new analysis to the argument that your partner made. It doesn't have to be a specifically new argument, but either add deeper warrants or additional impacts to the argument that the first opposition speaker made, while refuting the argument that the deputy prime minister made, the second government speaker made. If you guys have more questions about that, I didn't talk about that for very long because it is more or less the same as the second government speaker, who I did talk about for a little bit. But if you do have specific questions about the second opposition speaker, we can talk about that when we are done with the bottom half, which should only take a couple of minutes. So
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
As the first speaker on the bottom half, how much should you refer to the points that were brought up before you? Like, just basically in the bottom half, how much should you refer to the top half?
Yeah, great question. So it's very important that you respond to the most important, either so if you're the first government speaker, it's very important that you refer to and refute, ideally with new refutation, the arguments that were made on the opening opposition. So you should explicitly and point out that you are refuting the arguments that came out on top half. You should do that on both sides. You should definitely make sure to spend some time, though not necessarily the bulk of your time, refuting the arguments that have come before you. And similarly, as the third opposition speaker, the opposition extension speaker, you should both be refuting the arguments that came out on opening government and refuting the new argument that was made by the government extension speaker. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Cool.
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
Should you bring up your new argument first, or should you refute the arguments made by the last speaker first?
So you can do either. You should do this based on your habit. And what I mean by that is if you tend to run out of time, if you tend to spend too much time, the most important thing, the biggest and most important component of the extension speech is the new argument that you're advancing. So if you're somebody who tends to, if you refute first, spend too much time on refutation and then only have 1 minute to deliver your new argument, then deliver your new argument first and refute later, because your partner can always do some of that refutation or sort of add new depth to your refutation, but the whip speaker cannot make your new extension. They can only sort of, if you only spent 30 seconds on explicit refutation, they can try to make up for that. There are ways that they can make up for that strategically, but they can't make up for it if you didn't give enough time to making your extension and showing why your extension was important. Also, just to be clear, when I say extension, what I'm referring to is the new argument that you're making as the third speaker. So there are two big questions that people basically struggle with when they're on bottom half. The first is, how do I know if my contribution was new, and sort of how do I figure out what the newest and sort of best contribution extension for me to make is. And second, how do you make that argument sound new? Because even if you're making a new argument that hasn't been made earlier in the round, if it doesn't sound new, if your judges aren't persuaded that this is in fact a new argument, they're not going to credit it as such, and you won't be able to win. So first, how do you know if a contribution was new? There are a few things you can do. These are just sort of some examples of ways that you can think about it, but there are definitely other ways to try to figure out a new argument. Keep in mind that when you're preparing in prep as the bottom half team, a lot of sort of new teams are inclined to say, you know, like, oh, well, half the debate is going to happen before we have to speak. We don't really need to use our prep time very much. That's not true. In fact, your burden during prep on bottom half is maybe just as high, if not higher than the top half team, because you need to think of every argument that they thought of and more in order for you to have ideas of what the new arguments that are going to be made are. However, you probably don't want to actually write your extension until at least the first speaker from your half of the debate from your bench has spoken. So if you're the government extension speaker, until the prime minister has sort of given you a preview of what their arguments are going to be, you probably don't want to start extensively developing your extension speech or your extension argument. Instead, what you want to do is just have a list of possible extensions. So maybe have a list of like 7 or 8 possible areas for extension. And then once you know which of those, or if any of those, the top half team has already taken, then you have an idea of what you can use to expand upon, or where you can expand. So these are a few ways to identify what a new contribution is, and sort of how to make sure that your contribution is new. So there are a few things you can focus on. One thing can just be make your extension about a different group of people, a different relevant actor to the debate who hasn't been discussed yet. So that can be that it affects something that affects women disproportionately, that it affects people on the basis of race. A certain U.S. policy could affect the black community or the Hispanic community particularly heavily, that it could affect people on the basis of their geographic location, on the basis of their nationality, ethnicity, sexuality. It could also be something like how it affects a particular country in a specific way. So for instance, in the motion that I talked about, the remilitarizing Japan, talking about how that affects China, if that hasn't been discussed yet in the round, is incredibly important. And making your entire extension, like we're going to talk about how Japan shouldn't remilitarize because it's going to affect China in all these ways, or Japan should remilitarize because it'll affect China in all these ways. That is an excellent extension. You can talk about a important, it can't be an irrelevant actor, like making your entire extension about like how something's going to affect, like, remilitarizing in Japan is going to affect South Africa is probably not that relevant because it's unclear how South Africa is particularly relevant to Japanese foreign policy or to sort of global power. But that type of thing is really useful. I will talk about the best way to use your time for preparing on back half at the end of this little bit of discussion that we're doing now, but I'm not ignoring that question. A couple of other ways that you can think about it is to just sort of figure out if there's a field of analysis that hasn't really been touched on, or maybe it was mentioned quickly, but that it didn't get a huge amount of analysis. So what are examples of fields of analysis? International relations is an excellent one. In a lot of debates, you can discuss the sort of IR components or IR implications of a certain policy. Economics is one that can be particularly useful. Talking about feminism, how something affects sort of feminist theory or disproportionately affects women, is an extremely useful and extremely important thing to talk about. And if that's often neglected in debate, debate tends not to focus on sort of feminist issues. But if you can do that, it's often a really good extension to make because it's really easy to say, this has an incredible amount of magnitude because half of the people in the world are women. Therefore, it's probably more like you can even say, like, this is more important than whether something just affects China, because while there are 1.5 billion Chinese people, there are 3.5 billion women, and if this really affects the way the women are viewed around the world, then that's probably a bigger impact. That type of thing. It's illustrative of why feminism is a really excellent area for extension, aside from which it's just an important thing. Another thing you can talk about is history. So if a debate arises out of a sort of historical context. So if you're talking about, for instance, civil rights in the United States, or so if you're talking about, for example, criminal justice reform in the United States, discussing particularly the fact that first, criminal the criminals in the United States are disproportionately minorities, and that there's a history of sort of white versus minority tension in the United States. And you can talk about discrimination against Chinese people at the turn of the 19th century, or the turn of the 20th century, rather, or you can talk about the civil rights movement and slavery in the United States. You can talk modernly, or relatively modernly, about struggles in the Latino and Hispanic communities, about like the history of that struggle regarding immigration. Those types of histories, for instance, could be really relevant. And if you talk about sort of the history of minorities in the United States and make that your extension, that's very useful, relevant, new analysis. The last thing you can do to make a new contribution, and this is more difficult, so I would generally advise doing something else for now, but it's a good thing to have on the back burner, and it's very useful at sort of higher level BP debate, is to make almost the same argument that a top half team made, but make it so much better than the top half team made that it's probably not going to be their best argument. But if it's an argument that they didn't make very well or that they didn't spend very much time on, but which is incredibly important to the debate in a way that they haven't explored, you can make that your extension. So for instance, if a top half team touched on in the Japan debate that this will have if their words were pretty much this will increase tensions between the U.S. and China, your extension can be top half said this will increase the extension about U.S. and between the U.S. and increase tensions between the United States and China, and we're going to and uniquely on bottom half, or uniquely from closing government, we're going to explain to you why this is the most important argument in the round, because it effectively creates a new Cold War mentality in the world between two of the wealthiest and most powerful militaries in the world. We'd say that's probably important. That can be your extension, but you need to make it really clear. You need to make the ways that it's new extremely clear, and it can be very hard to do that. So I would advise generally staying away from that type of thing. But if you're in a pinch, or if you just see a really good opportunity to do it, it's something that's worth practicing and giving a shot if you feel that there is a circumstance where it makes sense. So the second thing then is, how do you make an argument sound new? So this is relevant both for if you're kind of exploring an argument that already has been, or even if you're giving a new argument, there are some ways in which it may not sound new if you're not careful. And that's a problem, because if it doesn't sound new, it'll be credited to the top half team. So there are a few things you can do to avoid this. First, make sure that your tagline is really distinct from the taglines that have already come up in the round. This is a really easy way to make sure that your argument sounds new. Make your tagline entirely, just make sure that you're not using the same language that the teams before you used in their taglines. In particular, what you can say as the extension speaker is you can even say specifically, what we are going to extend on uniquely on bottom half is X. That not just flags what your extension is clearly, but if you do it in a way that you have a different tagline, then you've already put in your judge's mind that this argument is unique. You've said this is what we're uniquely extending on. So it's already put in their mind that it's unique. And so if that's confirmed by the fact that you're using language that's different from the language that's been used earlier in the debate, that sort of confirms that it actually is unique. Your judge is now in a mindset, they're sort of predisposed to accept that your argument is a new argument. Although that's not sufficient to show that your argument is new. You can make your argument sound new, but then use only warrants that came up earlier. So make sure that you're not using warrants that already existed in the debate to prove your point. You can show how warrants that already exist in the debate are relevant to your argument, but the warrants that prove your argument should be new and unique. Importantly, the same way that you should have a different tagline, you should try as much as possible not to use different language from those who spoke before you. What do I mean by that? I mean that, for example, use different language and different examples. So for example, if your top half team only talked about the United States as their only examples, try as much as possible to avoid using the US examples. If you have to, you can, but just if possible, try to make very clear the differences between you and the team that spoke before you. And second, if they are using, for instance, if they were giving a lot of analysis, like IR analysis about realism, then, or if they were talking about neo-realism the whole time, which it doesn't matter if you don't know what that is, but if they're using a particular tagline like that, try as much as possible to avoid that tagline. You can still talk about sort of the same ideas you can talk about the principles that underlie that idea, but try not to be overly reliant on language that already existed within the round, because every time you do, it just makes it sound a little bit more like you're just reiterating and repeating arguments that were already made. So the last thing that's important to make your argument sound new is to have an effective whip. And the whip's job is to do two things, like I said earlier. You are supposed to summarize the round, which is basically like a rebuttal in Danaeus. You can structure it like a rebuttal. You can have talk about probably not 3 questions of crystallization, which is what I know some people on Danaeus do, but it can just be 3 areas of analysis, or what are the 3 most important things in this debate. You should, in the whip, refer to arguments from every part of the debate. So you should say, at opening government, we heard this argument about why we should stop drilling in Alaska. Opening opposition responded to them by saying this. Closing opposition responded to opening government by saying something else. But then what you do to make your argument sound new is you say, but what we told you uniquely at closing government was, my partner said this. And that argument beats all of the responses that the opposition team made to opening government and independently shows why this is the most important thing in the round. Something like that. But use the language of, and you can, I would honestly write this down and say these words as often as possible in your whip. You say, what my partner brought you uniquely in our extension was X, and that is the most important argument in the round because why? Why the letter? Why, a variable. Give a reason why it is. If you can show that you're the most important, that your argument was unique and important, you've won the round on bottom half, almost certainly. But aside from that unique component of illustrating the uniqueness of your partner's arguments, the whip speech is more or less a rebuttal. So that's pretty much all I have for bottom half. You guys, I have to go probably in about 6 or 7 minutes, but if you guys have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. And Mrs. Henderson has my email and is welcome to give it out to you guys. If you guys have more questions after I go, I will respond to them tonight or tomorrow. Or if you send them today, I'll respond to them tonight.
I was wondering, with the extension argument, what happens if it's not related to the arguments brought up by the first round? Do you, let's say that it's most important to the issue, not the argument so far?
Yeah, all that you have to do as either the government or the opposition, if you're on the government, you just need to give a reason that affirms the motion. So you just need to give an argument that supports the motion. It doesn't. So this is actually important. So what it can't do is it can't knife your opponent's argument, which is to say you can't make an argument on bottom half which says that directly and explicitly contradicts an argument that came out earlier. But that doesn't mean that you can't make arguments that exist in an entirely different realm. So if your top half team only talked about issues of international politics, and you decide that your extension is going to be about economics and not really talk about politics, that's still a perfectly valid extension as long as both of them are affirming the resolution. So it doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be particularly related to the arguments that came up earlier. It just can't contradict those arguments. Other questions? One thing that I'll do is I'll send a link. Hello? Hey. I'm going to, just after you guys, Aiden and Oliver, Mrs. Henderson just called me, so when she asks a question, I will tell you guys what the question was before I answer it that way, because you guys can't hear what the question is.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, preparing for back half. Go ahead. Sure. Okay, so this is a good question. Oliver and Aiden, the question was, can you... Okay, sounds good. And I'll answer Piper's question right afterwards, and then I'll probably have to go, but if there are more questions, give them my email, and I will respond to them. All right, sounds good. Okay, so the question was, can you knife in reverse? And so what they were saying is, for example, if you're the prime minister, and the bottom half asks asks a question, uh, asks a POI, for example. So if you're the opening government, and in the leader of the opposition speech, the closing government team asks them a question that reveals that it maybe illustrates what their argument is going to be. That sort of foreshadows what the closing government's extension is going to be. Is it possible for the opening government to knife the closing government by saying something that contradicts what they're alluding to in that point of information? The answer is, in short, no, because that argument hasn't really been made yet, and there's no way to know for sure whether or not that is their extension. But what I would, if it's a bad POI, and I think it would probably only be in the case that it's a bad POI that you would make an argument that explicitly contradicts what that POI was alluding to. What is generally more intelligent is if you're on top half and still have a speech to make, and the bottom half from your same bench asks a POI that you think might be revealing their extension, write an argument for that extension and give it in your speech that is still remaining. So if the closing government asks a POI and it reveals what their extension is going to be, put that argument in, and the second government speaker hasn't spoken yet, put that argument in the second government speaker's speech, because then you get credit for that. And if that was their extension, their extension is no longer new. But in terms of whether or not it would count as a knife to say something that would contradict that, probably not. I would say probably, in fact, definitely not. Knifing only happens from bottom half to top half. Hello? Hey. Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay. Okay, I'm going to repeat that and repeat that to Aiden and Oliver. So the question was, for example, if the bottom half team asks, for example, a POI saying, "Don't you think that this is going to cause a huge amount of inflation?" For example, to the top half team across the bench from them, would it count as knifing for, like, so if closing government asks opening opposition, don't you think this would cause a huge amount of inflation? And opening government then decides to make the argument, this won't cause inflation. Has opening government knifed the closing government team? The answer is no. Knifing only happens from top half to bottom half. If one of you is trying to argue that inflation will happen and one of you is trying to argue that inflation won't happen, either one of you is wrong or you're both being very unnuanced about what the argument is, because maybe something will cause inflation in the short term but will cause deflation in the long term, something like that. But in general, if you're on top half and you think that bottom half is asking a POI that's wrong, if you're worried that you're going to be in a situation where you would otherwise be knifing, either figure out if the POI they're asking is like false, if what they're alluding to is a lie, i.e. it's actually not going to cause inflation, in which case probably argue that, because if their whole advocacy was reliant upon it causing inflation, and you can show that it's not going to cause inflation, then their extension, which hasn't been given yet and is not ground to be knifed in the debate, doesn't exist yet. Or figure out if what your argument is wrong and just like reconsider whether or not that argument should be made. So the last question I promised Piper I would answer is, what's the best way to use your preparation, your prep time during back half? Just try to come up with as many, and you don't have to develop them very much, as many different areas for analysis as you can for the debate. So just like prep as many arguments as you can come up with. Don't write them out all the way, like don't develop them entirely, but figure out like sort of the foreshadowing of what those arguments could be, and try to predict as much as possible what the arguments that your opponents are going to make will be, so that you can figure out arguments that, like, you can figure out sort of the argument that you can make that will be most responsive to theirs, and therefore the most relevant argument. If that makes sense? And then once the round has begun and prep time is over, and you know what the team that's on your bench but ahead of you is going to argue, then you should start preparing your extension, ideally and hopefully from one of those arguments that like one of those sort of ideas for arguments that you prepared during prep time. How can you get the recording for those who are not here? There will be a link on my YouTube channel that I will find and send it to you guys. It'll probably take I think it takes about an hour for them to render this video and put it up, but it'll automatically go up online, and I will send you guys the link so that you can circulate that to others. I don't think, unfortunately, that it's ready immediately, but I will check on the off chance that it is. Sounds good. Mrs. Henderson, you can give them my email if you guys come up with any more questions. Feel free to get in touch with me and ask. Yeah, sounds good. I have to run to class, but this was fun, and good luck this weekend. Have a safe drive and a good tournament. See you later.
Thank you.